Hello, I'm Lynn Dale. I'm an environmental scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Today, I want to talk to you about the requirements of Clean Air Act Section 110A1 and 110A2. This section of the Clean Air Act requires states to submit state implementation plans that describes the structure of the programs they have in place to satisfy the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Specifically, I want to talk to you about a guidance that EPA has recently published and made available publicly that specifically describes the tasks that states would need to perform in assuring that their infrastructure state implementation plans are adequate, and if they need to revise or establish some new provisions for those plans, how they can do that to satisfy the requirements of the Act and to make sure that once submitted to EPA, it is deemed approvable. First, let me talk about Section 110A1. This requires states to adopt and submit what we refer to as an infrastructure state implementation plan. The state, within 3 years, would need to promulgate or revise their state implementation plan that would apply to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for any criteria pollutant. Now, generally, the state would submit this after they hold notice and public hearings to receive comments from the public. In Section 110A2 of the Clean Air Act, states are required to develop and maintain an air quality management program. And in that management would contain the structural elements that are required for them to operate their programs, such as enforceable emission limitations, ambient monitoring programs, enforcement programs, air quality modeling capabilities, and also ensuring that the agency has adequate personnel, adequate resources, and the legal authority to carry out the operations necessary. Now, the infrastructure SIP guidance that I'm speaking of is applicable to any future newly promulgated or revised National Ambient Air Quality Standard for any criteria pollutant. So states would develop and maintain their air quality management program structure because most states have ISIPs in place. But if we have a new or a revised National Ambient Air Quality Standard for a particular criteria pollutant that has been promulgated, a state air agency would review the adequacy of their existing infrastructure SIPs. Now, at that time, the state may cite EPA provisions or adopt new statutory authorities into their infrastructure SIPs. And ISIPs must demonstrate authority of the responsible air agency. Now, a state can provide certifications to EPA. The air agency can determine that existing EPA-approved infrastructure SIP elements do satisfy Section 110A requirements. And generally, a letter from the governor addressed to EPA declaring that their infrastructure SIP elements satisfy the Clean Act is the proper way of doing that. They can also include the relevant pre-existing provisions that are noted particularly in their infrastructure SIPs. Now, if an air agency determines that they must submit new provisions to satisfy the newly promulgated criteria pollutant NAAQS, they have the opportunity to do that, to submit that to EPA, but first, they would need to provide opportunity to the public at large to review and to provide comments to the state prior to the state's submission to EPA. Once the state has submitted their infrastructure SIP to EPA, the Clean Air Act directs EPA to take final action on that SIP within 1 year after the state has submitted their ISIP, and the EPA would need to determine that the state submission is complete. If EPA makes no finding of completeness, then the submission that the state provided to EPA will be deemed complete by operation of law on the date that is 6 months after the submission date. Now, one thing to remember here is that a completeness finding does not necessarily mean that the submission is approvable. EPA has basically operated on the basis that these elements and sub-elements are severable, and a state can choose to submit elements as they are completed. EPA may make a finding of failure to submit in whole or in part if the state fails to submit their infrastructure SIPs in time. The EPA monitors the submissions of the states. If a state has failed to make a required submission, or if EPA finds an incomplete submission, or if EPA has disapproved a required SIP submission in whole or in part, the EPA is obligated to develop what we call a federal implementation plan. Now, Native American tribes are not subject to this deadline for infrastructure SIP submissions according to the Tribal Authority Rule. Let me give you a federal implementation plan example, what we call a FIP. Several states currently do not have EPA-approved major source pre-construction permit programs in their infrastructure SIPs for prevention of significant deterioration. Now, EPA has developed FIPs. We have them in place for each area that is not covered by a state PSD program or that is not contained in an approved ISIP. I would now like to speak directly about the guidance that we have developed for the individual SIP elements that are required by the Clean Air Act Section 110A2. The first element I'd like to speak about is Element A. Element A deals with the state listing emission limits and other control measures that they have implemented into their infrastructure SIPs. So their infrastructure SIP in particular should identify existing EPA-approved provisions, or the state should include their newly adopted SIP provisions that are being adopted by the Air Agency and prior to their submission to EPA for approval. Now, one note I want to make here is that emission limitations and other control measures that are needed to attain the national ambient air quality standards in a non-attainment area, they're due on a different schedule than from the elements required under Section 110A2. For Element B, the state provides the provisions for operating and managing ambient air quality monitoring data systems. EPA has determined that the best practice for a state is to include their statutory or regulatory provisions that provide the authority and the responsibility to perform actions. Those actions include monitoring air quality relevant to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard pollutant at appropriate locations, also to submit data to the EPA's air quality system, provide EPA regions information regarding air quality monitoring activities, and also to obtain EPA's approval of any planned changes to monitor sites or changes to the network plan. Moving on to element C, the state would look in this element to make provisions for programs for enforcement of control measures and for construction or modification of stationary sources. This element has three sub-elements. The first one is enforcement. So the infrastructure SIP should identify the statutes, the regulations, and other provisions that the state has adopted that gives the air agency or its officials the power to conduct an enforcement program. The second sub-element that should be included are statewide regulation of new and modified minor sources and minor modifications of major sources. The infrastructure SIP identifies the existing EPA-approved provisions and/or it also must provide any new provisions that the state has adopted and received public comment for that govern minor source pre-construction. The third sub-element is pre-construction permitting of major sources and major modifications in areas designated attainment or those areas that are deemed unclassifiable. The infrastructure SIP should demonstrate that the state air agencies have the authority to implement a comprehensive PSD program for all PSD or prevention of significant deterioration subject sources. Moving on to element D, 110A2D, small paragraph I, contains two subsections. DI1 addresses emissions activities in one state that contributes significantly to the non-attainment or interferes with the maintenance of another state. We commonly refer to this as transport of a pollutant across state lines. DI2, the infrastructure SIPs must include provisions that prohibit any source or any emissions activity from one state from interfering with measures required of any other state to prevent significant deterioration of air quality or interference with protecting the visibility in that state. Now, the first element I talked about, DI1, we refer to prongs. And in this guidance, we're referring to prong 3. And we interpret prong 3 to mean that infrastructure SIPs must include provisions and prevent emissions of any regulated pollutant from interfering with other air agencies' comprehensive PSD permitting program. The second prong, or prong 4, that we include in this guidance deals with respect to the visibility transport. An infrastructure SIP must adequately address any contribution of a state's sources that impacts on visibility programs required in other states. So EPA interprets prong 4 to be pollutant specific, such that the infrastructure SIP need only address the potential for interference with protection of visibility. The second element that we look at in element D is element DII, which is interstate pollution abatement. The infrastructure SIP would need to contain provisions that the state has adopted that require new or modified major sources to be subject to PSD to notify neighboring air agencies of potential impacts from those sources. Now there's a second sub-element here that deals with international air pollution. EPA may require a state to revise its infrastructure SIP to alleviate international transport into another country if it is determined that it is occurring. For element E, the state must provide assurances to EPA that they have adequate resources and authority. So in their infrastructure SIP, the state would assure EPA they have adequate personnel, they would identify participating organizations and outline their responsibilities, and the infrastructure SIP would also provide assurances to EPA that the state has adequate authority. And the way they would do that would be to include statutes and also regulatory provisions. One of the second items that Element E requires is that the state must assure EPA that they have addressed the possibility of conflicts of interest, especially in state boards. Now, Clean Air Act Section 128 lays out some requirements for those state boards, and I would refer you to that act if you need more information, and it is contained in EPA's guidance, specifically what state boards should do. The third element of Element E is the oversight of local governments and regional air management agencies. In the infrastructure SIP, states assure EPA that they have adequate means to implement this oversight program, and they would describe that in the infrastructure SIP program. Let's move on to Element F. For Element F, this is the element that deals with stationary source monitoring. We're looking at some sub-elements in this requirement as well. So the infrastructure SIP that the state is submitting to EPA would need to provide for the program of periodic testing and inspection of stationary sources. It would also provide for the identification of allowable test methods that the state may use. Also, it would describe the State Air Quality Management Agency's program for source testing, and it would reference statutory authority for that program. Now, the infrastructure SIP would also need to provide assurances to EPA that there is the capability within the state that they can do periodic reporting and that they maintain emission data by sources. So the infrastructure SIP references and describes all of these provisions that would correlate for any emission reports based on the sources and the public availability of emission reports by sources. Element G. Element G is the element that requires the states to have provisions to address emergencies. So we like to refer to this as the emergency powers element. And what this requires is that a state would describe its authority to restrain any source from causing or contributing to emissions that may present an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health, welfare, or the environment. Moving on to Element H. Element H deals with making revisions to the infrastructure SIP itself. And here the EPA has determined that the best practice for a state is to include into their infrastructure SIP the statutory or regulatory provisions that provide the air agency with the authority to perform the following: to revise its Section 110 State Implementation Plan from time to time whenever it's determined it is needed, and also that the state has the authority to revise the plan if EPA finds that the plan to be substantially inadequate to attain the standards that are based in the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Moving on to Element I. Element I basically deals for plan revisions for non-attainment areas. Now, the EPA does not expect that infrastructure SIP elements will be needed to address this element. Specific SIP submissions for designated non-attainment areas as required under the Clean Air Act Title I, Part D, they are subject to a different submission schedule than those for this 110A infrastructure SIP elements. And they will be reviewed and acted upon through a totally separate process. Moving on to element J, which deals with the state creating the provisions for consulting within the state. Basically, the state would need to submit to EPA their authorities that allow them to consult with state and local and municipal government officials. Also, the actions that would be taken for public notification and the statutes and regulations that deal with PSD and visibility protections. For element K, this deals with air quality modeling and submission of modeling data. Now, the Air Quality Agency must conduct air quality modeling to predict effects on ambient air quality of any criteria pollutant. And they would also need to show that they can provide such modeling data to EPA if the EPA requests that data. Now for element L deals with the authority of levying permitting fees. Now in their infrastructure SIP, the state would need to provide citations to the regulations that provide for the collection of permitting fees under the state EPA-approved Title V permit program. For element M, consultation and participation by affected local entities, the State Air Agency would identify its policies and procedures that they have in place that would allow and promote consultation between particular state air agencies or local boards or regional boards. So, for example, if an air agency has a policy to conduct business or to do consultation with a regional planning coalition prior to adopting or amending a plan or policy, they would need to describe that and include that description in their infrastructure SIP submission to EPA. If you have questions about the guidance that we have available that guides you very specifically in how to complete your infrastructure SIP submissions, please direct your inquiries to me, Lynn Dale. My address is on the screen. Give me a call, send me an email. I will be glad to help you in any way I can. Thank you.